Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So, before I begin today, I just want to let everyone know that my graphic novel, Thomas Valiant, is still available on Indiegogo. The link for it is in the description. It is an 80-page giant with some spectacular art, which you're looking at in the background. And it is my attempt to take those great elements of storytelling that have been handed down in Western civilization, that have been hammered out for 3,000 years, some of which I'm going to be talking about today, and combine that with a traditional hero and put that all down on the page. And if any of that at all sounds appealing to you, you might want to click on the link in the description and go on over and see if my graphic novel is for you. But today, as I said, I want to talk about storytelling and some of the elements of storytelling that have been handed down to us in Western civilization and how they are being misused by your quote-unquote progressives. And to some extent, at the end, I'll get to the idea of canon and how it actually plays into this entire thing. But before I get to any of that storytelling, I have to start with the framework within which we exist today. And it is, unfortunately, a political framework. And I want to talk about that for a minute and talk about some realizations that I had over this past week, which I should have had before. And I'm just a little bit slow, really. That's the only reason I didn't think of this before. But I'm going to talk about that as a larger structure to all the things that I'm going to talk about later about storytelling. So the thing that I want to talk about first is the fact that you have a lot of people looking around them today and saying to themselves, where is this authoritarian attitude coming from so many people, from so many institutions, whether they be religious institutions or government institutions or extra-governmental institutions, movements that self-appoint themselves to be the conscience of our time, all of this. Where is this authoritarian streak coming from? And when I look at things, I'm saying to myself, well, if you look at it and what has been going on for the last 50, 60 years, since the 1960s, authoritarianism had to be the end of all of this. It just absolutely had to. There is no other end point that this could reach. And here's why. It's because, of course, you have a lot of people who are, we'll say, revolutionary spirited people. And whether they be actual revolutionary spirited people, as in they want to take everything and overthrow governments, or they're just minor revolutionary kinds of people who think they just want to turn over some societal institutions because they're not right. There is this streak of revolutionaries that began, again, with the 1960s and have moved all the way up until now. And their point, what they wish to do, is to take the norm of society, we'll call that norm position A, that norm position that existed, again, let's say within the 1950s, and to change it radically until they get to position Z. And the thing is that these revolutionary spirited people were intending to do this to move society from the norm of A over to Z by implanting in the people not so much a revolutionary spirit, but a rebellious spirit. To have them rebel against, well, basically everything. And this is partly what critical theory is, and I'm always talking about it. It is the idea that you're supposed to constantly criticize things with no constructive criticism at all, but that's a bit of a side note. But the thing is that this movement, again, from society, from point A to point Z, which these revolutionary spirited people wanted to do, was instituted through giving people a rebellious spirit, so that these people changed little by little the society from A to Z. But the thing is that there had to be a natural break on this mechanism. I think these people are smart enough so that they realize that there had to be a break. There had to be something in order to stop this rebellious spirit. Because, of course, if you get from point A all the way over to point Z, what's to stop that rebellious spirit in the people that you have instilled within them from moving it back from Z to A just out of nothing else than that same rebellious spirit? Well, there's nothing really. So you have to put a stop at some point to this rebellious spirit that you have instituted within the entire society. And that stop comes when they get to that point Z that these revolutionary spirited people want to get to. But here's the thing. When you're at point A, or at the very least, the attempt made at point A is to have a break, a stopping point that is instituted by reality, by what is true, by what is real. Now, this may be a number of different things for a number of different people. Some people would say that reality, that truth which they stop at, is God. Some might say it's natural law. Some might say it's reality. Some might say it's logic and reason. But for all of these things, there is a point where you say, this is true, and you stop here. So there's a natural break at point A, or at the very least, there is an attempt to appeal to that natural break, even though it may not seem so within a lot of history. But the thing is that with these revolutionary-minded people, what they wish to do at that point Z is the destruction of all ideas of truth itself. They don't believe that there is any truth with a capital T. They don't believe there is any real reality. They don't believe there is anything that you can hang your hat on and say, this is real. And so there is no natural break there. There's no way to say to people, to say to society, all right, we've gone far enough. Please stop here. We've met our goal. And they can't do that again because they have purposefully destroyed any ideas of what is true or that there is a truth to begin with when you get to point Z. So when you get to point Z, that break must always be something that is artificial. And that artificial break is simply power. This is why, partly, these people are accruing power and everything is a power dynamic. It's all about power. I'm going to talk in a few minutes about the comic industry. And one time I went through this podcast and I counted the amount of times within this 45-minute podcast that these three people that work for Marvel used the word power or a synonym for the word power. And it was over 30 times. And that wasn't even including the times they used the word superpower or anything of that kind. So for these people, it's all about power. And again, part of the reason why is because they need that power at the end to say, okay, we're telling you, stop now. And again, the reason why I said I should have realized this to begin with is because if you look at the revolutions over the last 100 years or so, this is exactly what happens when the revolutionaries actually get to overthrow a country. When these revolutionary-minded people actually get to be in control, the people who don't want to stop rebelling, well, it doesn't matter if they were their closest comrades. Now is the time where they either get shipped off to a gulag or get an ice pick in the back of the head. So again, the entire thing is that when these revolutionaries move the norm of society from point A to point Z, they need a stopping mechanism. That stopping mechanism must be artificial because they have destroyed all ideas of what is true and what is real, and therefore that artificial stopping mechanism is authority based upon power, nothing else. And so authoritarianism is the rule of the day. And by the way, I think we're probably around point X right now. But what does all of this have to do with storytelling? Well, I would say it has a great deal to do with the storytelling we see around us today. And that's what I'm going to talk about. And again, I'm going to use the comic industry as my example of this, as always, because it is a very good microcosm where we can see an entire industry with these people who run it who like to talk a lot. And so we can see where these ideas come from. We can see where they go to. We can see the mechanism by which they are trying to change society through their storytelling. And you can take these ideas within this mechanism, within this industry, and apply it to larger industries, certainly larger industries which deal with storytelling. But first, let's look at the original way a story has been constructed within Western civilization, I would say for 3,000 years, expressed in its greatest form by Aristotle 2,400 years ago, who was working off of stories that were 800 years older than him. And this form of storytelling that he described has been the basis, sometimes more, sometimes less, within our society for 3,000 years, up until about the last 100 years or so, wherein it started to be corrupted by a quote-unquote progressive norm. But for Aristotle, who is working off of concepts of reason and logic, he's saying that a story is a representation of reality. And this is for many different reasons. One of the reasons being that this is how you take that image of reality that you are creating and get your audience to connect to it. Because, of course, you're dealing with the reality of the human being themselves. You're understanding that. You're playing to that. And you're also connecting that with the reality that exists around us in our normal everyday lives. And so if you're putting all the markers of that reality, that normal reality, down on the page or within your story, whatever kind it may be, then the person can connect to that story automatically as if they were connecting to the real world. And so you're connecting your story to your audience when you make your story a representation of reality. Now, of course, I deal most with fantastical stories, and we'll get into that in a bit, but those fantastical elements are to some extent a logical extension of the argument and representation of reality, where you say, Well, hypothetically, if this part of reality was changed, then what exactly would be the way that reality would play out and how it would play out within the lives of individuals? And that's just one of the elements of why stories are like that. There are many others, some being the way that human beings learn, how we are imitative learners, how we used to do so in a childlike manner when we first were brought into this world. And there is that connection between imitation, which we love, and this connection between how we learn as creatures, which is to build upon knowledge. There's a lot of different reasons for this representation of reality. So that is again your norm of storytelling that has been instituted and refined throughout Western civilization for 3,000 years. But what do we have when you look at these quote-unquote progressive stories of today? You have something that is based upon a lack of reality. Quite specifically, they believe, these writers, these people who put these stories together, they believe that there is no reality, and certainly that there is no reality for a human being. The thing that I most commonly point back to is an interview that I covered with a woman called Marika Tamaki. She wrote for Marvel and DC, the two big comic companies. Before that, she wrote novels, which got a lot of progressive awards. And this interview, which I covered, which if you want to go find it on my channel, just put in her name, Marika Tamaki, it will pop right up. Anyway, in this interview that she did, which I covered, she talked to the interviewer about what she thought human beings were. And she said, in no uncertain terms, that human beings were nothing. That as human beings, we are made up of nothing. And the only thing that we can do is to be a mimic, is to be an ape, is to be a play actor within our own lives. That is to say, what she described was the fact that we as individuals, as we exist within this world, all we do is see other individuals acting in a very specific way. And we take those things into ourselves. And by the way, this can be seeing other individuals either on television or within your own life. It really doesn't matter, which explains why exactly these people can't distinguish between reality and television. But anyways, she said that you see these things within your life, and you take them within your memory, as if you were a curator at a museum, and you put them in the back room of your mind, until such time you wish to bring them out and put them on full display within your museum. And at that time, all you do is take these memories out into the forefront of your mind, and you display them through your actions, through your mimicking of what you believe you saw the other person do originally. And that's all human beings are in her estimation. And while she may be unique in that she understands and can express this much more than other people who write these quote-unquote progressive stories, I believe the same strain of understanding of what a human being is, or misunderstanding of what a human being is what is in the minds of all of these progressive writers. Again, they believe there is no truth, either within the human being or within reality, that we can hang our hats on. And so how does this express itself within the storytelling? Well, let's move on to another interview that I covered, an interview with a man named Court Lane. Now, he was doing this interview with Sana Amanat, and they were both talking about a movie that was coming on the Disney Channel that was based upon Marvel characters. Marvel characters, by the way, that no one likes. Characters like Kamala Khan, like America Chavez, like Captain Marvel, and a whole host of others that most people probably never heard of. And yet they were making this movie about them on Disney. But the point being that Court Lane and Sana Amanat both are vice presidents within their respective place at the Disney company. Sana Amanat being the vice president of content and character development over at Marvel Comics, and Court Lane being a vice president of animation and family entertainment. And Court Lane, I think, really expressed it very well when he talked about what he thought his job was as a storyteller. And what he said was, well, first of all, this entire show was geared around being sold to young girls, very young girls. And they had a test audience of simply young girls, and that was it. And how did he seek to appeal to those young girls? Was it a representation of reality that could connect with the humanity within them? No. What he sought to do was to employ an animation company that could, and was known to, put very great detail into facial expressions and hair so that these children, these girls, would see that and connect with what was superficial and emotional. And his point being that what he thought his job was, he said, I think my job is over when he sees these young girls taking those ideas expressed within the show and being able to explain them back to him. And again, these ideas are quote-unquote progressive ideas. Ideas like everything is based upon empathy, ideas like body positivity, and a whole bunch of other smaller progressive ideas. Now, just very briefly, what is this mechanism by which he is using? Well, this mechanism is the 1939 definition of propaganda. Propaganda being defined at that time by a people who very much knew what propaganda was, being defined as a way to teach someone something that gets around their rational mind. And this is exactly the mechanism which he was describing. He thought his job was done when these girls learned exactly what he wanted them to learn, these progressive ideas. And they were taught them by the emotional and the superficial. And it was specifically done that way in order to teach these young girls exactly that. And just a few other small examples before I get to my last example. There was a comic put out that I covered where the writer was simply a comedian that they brought on to Marvel Comics to write it. It was X-Men Mojo. And the entire interview with him talking about the creation of this comic was talking about, again, how the emotional, in the guise of, as they usually say, the empathetic, as being the entire core of the story. Now, if you want to have empathy in your story, I think it has a place. It has a place within human existence. But to make it the entire center of the story, no. That is a way of twisting around what you are actually saying. Or this other book con that I covered, where Marvel was a major part of this book con. And within that book con, there was a panel wherein you had a group of authors, all female by the way, who wrote children's picture books, and they were discussing how to implant these social ideological ideas, these quote-unquote progressive ideas, into their children's picture books. And they gave a list as long as your arm, what they thought they should be implanting into these books. And again, they're all quote-unquote progressive ideas. And they all nodded their head when someone quoted an older author who had set up this ideal of what they should do, who said, you want to be as close as possible to being right there behind the child, whispering in their ear as they are underneath their blankets reading your book. And for this instance, we're dealing with very small children who are reading picture books, so people who really don't have much of a developed rational mind to begin with, and they want to whisper these things in their ear. Again, this is the way of getting around the rational mind of these children so that they can stay that way when they become adults and teach them these progressive norms. But I think the best one, the one that I wanted to concentrate on, is an interview with Sana Amanat, the Vice President of Character Development and Content, who was and may still be the person, I think, within operational control of Marvel Comics, and she did an interview with Fast Company, which I covered a long time ago, wherein at the end she described comics and these comic book heroes and stories as being the new mythology. Now, there's a reason why I like to listen to Sana Amanat, not only because she is someone who is in control of almost this entire company, but certainly the leader of this entire industry, but she does not speak judiciously in any way. She has this fumbly-bumbly way of expressing herself where she starts a sentence, gets halfway through, then stops, then starts the sentence again, and tries to express herself 1 or 2 times in this way. So she usually expresses things, I would say, that are very true and honest. Because of the fact that she can't speak judiciously, this is a window within, I hate using the word, but within the subconscious of what she actually means. And so you get to hear unfiltered thoughts coming out of her mouth. And I say all that because, of course, she uses the word mythology. Now, she could have used a plethora of other words that don't have such connotations as mythology. She could have said tall tales. She could have said adventure stories. She could have said fantasy. She could have said fairy tales. She could have even said legends and myth, but she used the word mythology. And I'll get back to that in a second. But to continue on with what she said they needed to use this mythology in a psychological way in order to, and these are her words, push positive ideas. And if you listen to the entire interview, you know that positive ideas for her are very progressive ideas. One of the ones that she typically goes on about is body diversity. And the reason for that, I would say, is because she is a self-described dumpy brown girl. And I would say add that to the fact that her multi-millionaire brother married a white supermodel, she probably has some issues. But there are other progressive norms that she pushes. She's always talking about progressive representation. She's always talking about intersectionality, and she's always talking about power. So again, the point being that she talks about taking these stories, using them as a new mythology to get into the psyche of the reader and push on them these new progressive norms, which she sees as positive. Now, first of all, I would say if you're writing a true story and you are using that representation of reality to connect to your audience, you don't need to push anything. But of course, if you don't have that, if you're working within a system where you don't even believe that is capable of happening, then what do? Well, you gotta push ideas upon people. Again, this is forceful. This is an authority pushing into your mind these ideas they want you to have. In a way, again, in a psychological way, and she uses that word quite specifically again, which I would say denotes, once again, the idea that they are getting around the person's rational mind. Now, for a second, let's look at this word mythology that she uses. Now, if I was to look at what mythology was, as a person who loves mythology and has read a lot about mythology and has studied myth as it connects to religion, as it connects to philosophy, as it connects to society in general that it existed within, I would say that mythology is an expression of a very specific group of people in a very specific time, in a very specific place, trying to understand as best as they can their connection as human beings to the reality around them. And again, my definition has within it, baked within it, the ideas that there is a fixed human nature, that there is a fixed nature to reality, and that we can connect the two through our own human understanding. But if you are one of these progressive people, one of these people who don't believe that anything exists within reality that you can call true, that reality is just what you declare it to be, that there is no fixed human nature of any kind, if you're one of these people, what would you see myth as being? Well, you would see mythology as being a collection of fanciful stories, and by fanciful stories, if you want to strip it down to exactly what that would mean, I think in the mind of a progressive, it would be a collection of lies used to control the people in this very specific time and place. And so if they wish to set up their stories, their current science fiction and fantasy stories, again, no matter what they be, within comics, within the movies, within television, within anything that you consume as science fiction and fantasy, if they wish to set up these stories as the new mythology, and we use that definition of mythology, then what exactly are they doing? Again, if we use the words of Sana Amanat, what they would be doing is using this collection of lies in order to psychologically impact, in a way that gets around the rational mind of the reader and the audience, these people, and teach them something, push on them these radical ideas that they themselves wish to implant within the minds of their audience and therefore control. Again, this would just be that exact mechanism. It would be, again, a collection of lies used to control a people in a certain time and place. And if you go back to what I talked about to begin with, that political structure, that structure of authoritarianism that I talked about at the first, this new mythology, of course, would be the perfect vehicle to institute this authoritarian idea within the minds of the people themselves that they wish to control, so that those people accept that control. Because again, there needs to be that artificial break to say, nope, you got to stop here. We're at point Z. We're stopping now. And they only can institute that through authoritarian measures. But authoritarian measures work best when you're able to trick the people into believing that it is their own volition, their own will that wants this to be done. Or at the very least, get enough people within society to believe that so that they are the ones who maintain control. And so here's where we get into the idea of canon. I would say it is not by chance in any way that these quote-unquote progressive people who produce these progressive stories not only use this word canon over and over again, but they use it to beat the people over the head to say, yeah, we define what is actually real. Because what is canon? Where does it come from? Well, it's an ancient Greek word meaning a rule or a standard, which in the medieval period got expressed as a standard or a law. So basically, it is the ruler, the yardstick, whereby reality is actually seen, whereby reality is actually measured. But again, let's look at mythology. I would say mythology, once again, is built upon those ideas that Aristotle himself expressed, built upon the fact that you have these people and they're trying to understand their position within reality, and they're trying to use the mechanisms available to them as human beings, which is to say, the way that human beings learn. And the way that we learn is we take the knowledge that we have, we try to put it together so we can understand things that we previously did not know. And although within logic and reason, you do that in a very specific way, in a very controlled manner, controlling both the ideas that you are using and the form within which you are using them, within the older ways of trying to understand these things, within the ideas of mythology, they had to use certain cheats. That is to say, that's where the fantasy came in. You hit something which you simply do not understand, and you don't have the capability to understand, and therefore they put in some fantastical thing. This is the cheat that they use to gloss over the fact that we don't understand this specific thing. We'll gloss it over and move on for now to try to continue to understand how we as human beings connect with this reality. And here's the thing, the reason why I'm talking about this. I was looking at some specific comics this week, and I was talking about this exact thing on my live stream a couple of nights ago. And these stories were about very mythological things. One was a Thor story, one was a Wonder Woman story, which is based upon, at its base, Greek mythology, and one was an Excalibur story, which depends heavily on British legends and myth. And I noticed something very specific about these three stories in particular. It's the fact that you have these writers, and each of them is actually trying to write a good story, but they're not connecting with the humanity of their reader at all. And the thing is that the whole point is they're writing a good quote-unquote story, because I wouldn't say it's a story, because it's not a representation of reality, and it's not a representation of reality because it is simply taking a lot of these fanciful elements, a whole bunch of them, and connecting them together in a very clever way. And when these fanciful elements are elements that are detached from the connection of humanity, you are detaching yourself from a connection with your audience, but you're keeping them there through the intrigue of how these things are actually connected. So, to put it succinctly, what they are doing is they're using constant spectacle in order to dazzle their audience in such a way to make the audience believe that the spectacle itself is actually a real story, which it isn't. They take these things that, again, are not connected to the human, are not connected to reality, are simply fanciful elements that they know we will be attracted to, and they connect all of these fanciful elements together with each other. And so there is no connection to what Aristotle would say is the true, the good, the beautiful. There is simply interconnection of these fanciful elements to make it look like it actually is a story. That is to say, once again, if we look back at what I was saying about mythology, they use the fantastical as a cheat in order to continue their understanding, but this new mythology is simply a collection of cheats, all put together as a shiny little thing that people are attracted to and think is a story, in order to, once again, as Sana Amanat expressed, impact the audience in a psychological way in order to push upon them these progressive ideas. And again, this is why the idea of canon and the control of canon by these progressive individuals is so important right now. Because they're saying, this is the rule, this is the standard wherein you will interpret this reality that we are presenting to you. And since, as they believe, as expressed by Marika Tamaki, there is no real difference between what you see down on a page or on the television screen and what you do in your actual life, this too is the rule by which you need to interpret the reality that is around you. And this is why, in part, I concentrate on things which most people see as being frivolous. That is to say, concentrating on things like comic book stories, movie stories, television stories. Why would you concentrate on those things when we're in such dire straits? When we're in a culture war and we seem to be losing? Well, I would say because this is the basis whereby these people, these progressive people, are using their lever of power to move us into the exact position that they want us to go. And if this is the new mythology that they want to control us with, that makes them, as the controllers of canon, that makes them the high priests of this new religion, of this new mythology, whereby they can tell us, you must understand this, you must accept this, and you do so upon nothing more than our authority. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like. Hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, the link for my graphic novel is in the description if you want to go over and see my attempt to take all of these story elements that I'm talking about in my videos and put them down within a true story, a true representation of reality, which has a true hero in it, an 80-page giant with spectacular art. If that appeals to you in any way, you might want to click the link in the description and go on over to the Indiegogo page and see if my graphic novel is for you. All right, so I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.